Welcome to the IISS, everybody. My name is Matthew Harries. I'm a research fellow for transatlantic affairs here at the Institute and managing editor of our journal Survival, which is aptly named for our discussion today, which is entitled Nuclear Arsenal Vulnerability and the New Era of Counterforce. And I'm delighted to host this discussion because strategic stability and deterrence is, I think, the bread and butter issue of the IISS, and we have two excellent speakers to guide us through it today. To my right is Keir Lieber, who is Associate Professor in the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. To my left is Darryl Press, who is Associate Professor in the Department of Government at Dartmouth College, and they've both published widely on these issues, including together, perhaps most notably in a co-authored article in Foreign Affairs of 2006 entitled The Rise of US Nuclear Primacy. They're going to speak for a total of about 25 minutes, which will give us plenty of time for question and answer. Over to you, Keir.
Great, thank you. I'll try and go quickly so we can stay within the time limit. Thank you, Matthew, for hosting us, and thank you for joining us. You're clearly not scared off by the term counterforce enough to be here. As you'll see from our slides, we're talking about nuclear strategy and nuclear capabilities and what happens as technology has changed over the years. But what we're most interested in, of course, is strategic stability and nuclear deterrence issues. We just feel that they're very much tied to capabilities and technologies at any given time. What our main argument is that the long-term trends that we see, all rooted in the computer revolution, are increasing the vulnerability of nuclear forces. It's increasing the vulnerability of every nuclear country's nuclear forces, not equally, of course, but every state that has nuclear weapons and seeks to protect those weapons against potential adversaries has something to worry about now. The main changes that we discuss are leaps in weapons accuracy and the revolution in remote sensing. And very roughly, I'll talk about accuracy. Darryl will take over and talk about advances in remote sensing. All of this, of course, and of course, the related developments in data processing and communication, what you do with that technology. Everyone, I wouldn't say everyone, but many people are familiar with these developments, the improved accuracy of weapons in the modern era, for example. But few people have paid attention to their cumulative consequences, which we'll try to focus on. And finally, just to point out as we proceed, this creates risks and opportunities. I mean, most of the time we focus on the risks, the dangers of vulnerable arsenals, but that can also, it's a two-sided coin, and there may be opportunities there, particularly for states that face adversaries who potentially would use nuclear weapons in a conflict and want to do something about that. Take a step back. From the beginning of the nuclear age, states, countries have had essentially three strategies for survivability, for protecting their arsenals: hardening, concealment, and redundancy. Hardening is the obvious one. We're going to put missiles in the ground and we're going to protect them. Storage sites for warheads, hardened aircraft shelters. Okay, so protect against direct attack, hardening. Concealment is not simply putting camouflage over something, although it can be use of decoys and others, but mobile missiles in particular are a form of concealment. You send mobile missiles out into onto the land to hide, essentially. Submarines out hiding in the great blue oceans, etc. Concealment, second big strategy. And a third strategy is to build more and diverse kinds of delivery systems and weapons, redundancy. What we are arguing, one of the reason we think this is so important, is that the advances in accuracy and sensing are directly undermining two of the three main pillars of arsenal survivability. And, if we're feeling snarky, we've had a couple pints, we make the point that to our arms control friends that arms control is arguably undermining the third pillar of survivability, which is redundancy. As arsenal size declines, becomes more vulnerable. So again, survivability getting more challenging for everyone, but not equally so. If you're facing a sophisticated adversary and you have a small arsenal, you're clearly going to be more vulnerable than, say, the United States facing North Korea. So let's get down to business. Accuracy improvements. What are we talking about accuracy improvements? Well, first and foremost, increased probability of kill. So you take a missile, you fire it against a target. How has anything changed in the last 20, 25 years, 30 years, in terms of the ability to do that? Well, it turns out a lot has changed. I'll talk about that immediately. The PK levels, the ability to destroy hardened targets, has improved dramatically. A second big change relating to accuracy has to do with fratricide. So in the old days, targeters in the Cold War would assign 2 warheads to any given target. They couldn't really do more than that. It wouldn't increase the probability of killing the target because of the probability of one warhead detonating and affecting an incoming warhead. That particularly was the case with ground bursts that would kick up a lot of debris. An incoming warhead could not hit it. So what you would do is you do one air burst, one ground burst, and that was basically the best that you could do as a targeter. Fact is, accuracy has essentially eliminated the problem of fratricide. I'll try and explain that in a second. But the impact is that you can now do many-on-one targeting to increase the probability of destroying a given target. A third implication of the revolution in accuracy has to do with submarines, and largely because of the ability of submarines to fix their location before firing their missiles is a new development with GPS. And in the old days, of course, submarines were not counterforce systems. You wouldn't use it to destroy an adversary's hardened facilities. You could use submarine-launched ballistic missiles to destroy cities. It was countervalued. City busting was the only role that submarines could really play. Today, submarines have become a potent counterforce system because of improved accuracy. Fourth, the developments in conventional weapons accuracy have advanced such that conventional weapons can be thought of and used in a counterforce role, counterforce against a nuclear arsenal. That has two effects. Number one, that adds to, again, the number of systems and the weapons that you can use to target an enemy's force, but also it has the implication that you can do counterforce without killing millions of people if you're using conventional weapons, for example. And fifth, and related to the low fatality issue, is the greater effectiveness of air bursts. So the big problem there, of course, when you do ground bursts trying to destroy a silo, you create lots of lethal radioactive fallout. The ground gets sucked up, the dirt and debris gets sucked up into the mushroom cloud. As it cools, it mixes with radioactive material, comes back down to Earth. That's the big killer. I mean, of course, prompt radiation from nuclear weapons is a killer too, but usually it's just the overpressure. When you get fallout, it kills lots of people. If you can do air bursts with nuclear weapons that create enough overpressure to destroy the target without creating fallout, you're talking about dramatically reduced fatalities when it comes to counterforce operations. Another development which I should mention doesn't clearly fit within accuracy or sensing in terms of those categories, is reprogramming. This is essentially the ability of targeters to replace missile failures. If it happens early enough in a launch, a missile comes out of a silo and fails in the boost phase in particular, programmers can immediately give that missile's target coordinates to another missile and warhead and fire it directly. And this has some important consequences for what we're talking about. Darryl will be talking about sensing developments across the board, which are in some ways even more important than the accuracy improvements. What we did was we used the old formulas that targeters have used for years to come up with a comparison between old weapons and new weapons. It might be a little small here, but essentially, on this side we have ICBMs, on this side SLBMs. On ICBMs here we have 1985, this is in the US arsenal, a 1985 ICBM, Minuteman III, and a 2015, 2016 Minuteman III with improved guidance. Over here we have the 1985 Trident I, and now we have Trident II, two different columns for the W-76 warhead and the W-88 warhead. Okay, so on the left, this is the breakdown of possible outcomes against a 3,000 psi reinforced target, so a silo, a very hardened silo. A 1985 ICBM fired at that would have basically a 55% chance of hitting and destroying the target. Okay, leaving about a 25% chance that it gets there detonates but misses the target. The target survives. And across the board, we use a 20% reliability figure, meaning if you take 2 out of 10 missiles that are fired, something will go wrong. It's a very conservative reliability estimate, but it's typically one that's used, especially in past analyses, that you figure 20% won't work at all. Well, as you can see, from 1985 to 2015, the miss category has shrunk dramatically, and that's because of guidance improvements to Minuteman III missiles. On the submarine side, it's even more dramatic, of course. As you can see here, with the W-76, we're down to about 8-9% category for the miss, and virtually non-existent category for the W-88. And that largely has to do with the larger yield on the W-88. Okay, so this is just a quick cut at what's driving the PK, increased probability of kill. But let me just show you the results of the analysis. This is just a quick build, and then I'll give it to Daryl. What we have here is the old system. We've got, no, you're good. Stay where you are. Minuteman III W-78, 1985. Open source estimate of 183 meters CEP. Yield 335 kilotons, open source. Reliability, we're using the 80% figure, 0.8. We're using 2-on-1, so 2 warheads against a single 3,000 PSI target. And the probability kill of a single weapon, two weapons against 2 warheads against 1 target, is 0.79. Against the entire target set that we're using here is 200 hard targets and related facilities, so silos, mobile missile shelters, storage sites, command and control. Why 200? Well, we've done it with 300, we've done it with 400, we did it with 100. 200 is roughly the number you would come up with if you were thinking of a Chinese arsenal where you were contemplating a counterforce attack. Perhaps a North Korean arsenal with a generated mobile missile force, and others. So 3,000 PSI targets, 200 of them. The problem is, if you go after everything, you still have a 42 surviving out of the 200, just using the 1985 Minuteman III ICBMs. Okay. Now we color this red because that's not a very good outcome. If you're contemplating a first strike, this is not, 42 weapons is going to ruin your day. What about using Minuteman III W-78 2016 and the Trident II W-88s 2016? Well, you've got a dramatic improvement in the accuracy of the weapons, down to 90 meters CEP for the W-88, again open source, with a much bigger yield, 455 kilotons, same reliability, same 2-on-1 attack, improved PK for sure, 0.79 up to 0.93 and 0.96, but against 200 targets, that doesn't work out so well. You still have 13 and 8 sites surviving. So 8 silos with MIRVed warheads, for example, again, results in a potentially unacceptable cost for anybody contemplating this kind of operation. So things have changed, but is that enough? Well, let's layer on more into the analysis here. What if we relax that reliability figure? And we've given this talk, we've given a related talk all over the place, including at national labs in the US, to weapons designers, and occasionally we get the comment, using 0.8 is too conservative. I mean, we can look at Russian and Soviet launch, satellite launches and rocket tests and everything, and they're close to 0.95 just in terms of open source data about what we see. If we assume only 1 out of 10 fail, and even that might be conservative, we start to get a different outcome. 0.99 PK with 2 surviving, okay, but 2 may not be enough. Let's layer in reprogramming to replace those boost failures, and we get an expected outcome of 0 surviving. If instead of 2-on-1 we do 3-on-1 without reprogramming, we get 0 surviving. And last but not least, I didn't say anything about yet, the compensated fuse on the W-76. So at least reportedly in the U.S. arsenal, all the W-76s new are being replaced. The fusing mechanism is being replaced, and what it essentially does is correct for accuracy errors. An incoming warhead set to detonate at a certain altitude. It knows where it is, but it can't steer itself. Okay, this is ballistic trajectory of a missile coming in. But what it can do with the new compensated fuse is adjust its height of burst to compensate for its inaccuracy. So if this is the target and the missile's coming in high and it normally would detonate at this altitude, it detonates a little higher to create overpressure directly above the target. Likewise, if it's going short of the target, it waits longer and longer and detonates closer to the target. That increase has a dramatic increase on the probability of hard target kill and results in one hard target surviving in our analysis. There is no silver bullet. It's not like the compensated fuse is the dramatic single answer to the problem of counterforce targeting, but we have a series of steps that have transformed the ability to do counterforce at the nuclear level. The result is the significant increased vulnerability of hard targets, not just theirs from, say, a U.S. perspective or Allied perspective, but all nuclear arsenals are arguably more vulnerable today than they ever been, and have become vulnerable in a qualitative way in terms of outcomes. Let me get Daryl.
Thanks. So the summary of what Kira said so far is that all the innovations that have happened over the past 25 years in the accuracy revolution has made hard targets, including nuclear hard targets, vastly, vastly more vulnerable than ever in the past. To some extent, though, as dramatic as the accuracy revolution is in terms of its consequences, we believe it's actually smaller than the consequences of the variety of cumulative changes in the world of remote sensing. And so we're just going to talk really briefly about some aspects of this. But in fact, the changes in remote sensing are all around us. I mean, when you go to the physician or the radiologist and they look real time at the soft tissue in your knee, or you get an fMRI and you can see not only the neurons themselves, but the functioning of the neurons, it gives you a sense of the changes in remote sensing. And these changes in remote sensing have been exploited dramatically in the military sphere. So when we think about kind of comparing remote sensing in the early nuclear age with remote sensing today, the changes are multidimensional. So in terms of the growth in the number and diversity of sensing platforms, in the early nuclear age, the principal platforms for remote sensing were some reconnaissance aircraft, early satellites, and some submarine and undersea sensors. Today, those are all very, very important, but they're supplemented by whole families of unattended ground sensors. They're supplemented by aerial drones. They're supplemented today by undersea drones. They're supplemented by a variety of targeting, tracking, locating micro sensors that can be implanted in a variety of ways. So there's been a huge leap in the number and the diversity of sensors. There's been a huge leap in the types of signals that countries are gathering and exploiting for the purpose of tracking mobile and difficult to find targets. So again, if you think in the 1950s, it was principally optical sensors and some radar, and undersea some sonar. All very important today. But you add to this spectroscopy, which allows satellites and other remote sensors to be able to use these small vapor releases from vehicles or locations to back out what are the materials in those vehicles. You add interferometry. You go from a world in which you were exploiting the visible part of the electromagnetic spectrum to a world in which there are hyperspectral sensors that are exploiting the entire spectrum. In terms of persistence, old Cold War systems, whether aircraft or satellites, used to streak over targets and then quickly pass over the horizon. Whereas today, there are a whole variety of systems available to the United States, to the UK, and to others who are able to stay and loiter and therefore gather streams of data. There's been vast improvements that basically everybody's aware of with respect to resolution of the signals, of the processing of the signals, plus the processing power and ability to communicate this information rapidly from sensor to user. The point is that none of those changes in and of themselves changes the world. Taken together, they have already and continue to, in the future, vastly transform what can be known about large deployment areas underseas, on the surface of the Earth, and in the sky and in space. The challenge for us as analysts is how in the open source can you characterize how dramatic these changes are without even either dealing with the complexity of this or the classification. So what we've tried to do in this work is to give insights into the scale of the change by doing a snapshot of a small subset of these. And the reason we chose radar satellites and some radar-based standoff unmanned aerial vehicles and penetrating UAVs is simply, it's not because those are the most dramatic systems, have the most dramatic effects, but it's because the limitations of their capabilities are typically determined by line of sight. And the terrain of the Earth is not classifiable. And so using modern commercially available geospatial analysis software and some trigonometry, we can do all kinds of things at the open source, at the unclassified level, to determine the effectiveness of these systems, given that they're basically limited now, given the sensor capabilities, they're basically limited now by line of sight. And we use the case of North Korea here in North Korean roads. All right. So in a short presentation, I'll spare you the analysis, so we would be happy to talk through this. We used some information on US satellites that was kindly declassified for the United States by the Russians. Very nice of them to image our radar satellites for us. We used some geospatial analysis software, and then we relearned high school trigonometry, which took some time to do. And basically, we were able to estimate how frequently a given satellite constellation passes close enough to North Korea to be able to effectively image their roads. Taking into consideration, again, the elevation of the satellites, the average offset distance from the satellite and a given target, and the topography of North Korea. So we compiled a digital roadmap of North Korea. We took their topographical information and basically had fancy geospatial analysis software do the work for us. The takeaway is this, is the answer to the question of how frequently the United States or US and allied satellite networks can image North Korean roads depends on whose satellites we're talking about, and who we're cooperating with. So if you look in the open source, the United States has 6 large radar satellites who are doing this mission. In reality, it is my belief, though I'm not certain, that there are a number of additional radar satellites that the United States uses on top of that. But if there are only 6 satellites, there are basically 15 usable passes a day, and that means US satellites can cover, we use the threshold of 90% of North Korean roads every 91 minutes. But suppose hypothetically, either today or in the future, the United States and its NATO allies are coordinating their satellite coverage of North Korea, which I would say a prudent North Korean planner ought to assume, whether or not it's true. You get the average coverage time down to 34 minutes, meaning every 34 minutes a satellite comes over and is able to image 90% of North Korean roads. Suppose the United States is also coordinating with Japan, the numbers drop down to 27 minutes. My sense is, again, I have no idea if these coordinating agreements exist today between NATO or Japan, but my sense is that number is actually quite a bit higher than it is. That's, again, the open source using the 6 big radar satellites. But it's easy to kind of see that the United States is doing other things with some radar satellites to increase that number. 24 to 27 minutes might seem too long to you to make you comfortable with this, but keep in mind we haven't included in this the optical or the IR satellites, or the unattended ground sensors, or the UAVs. Let me kind of show you the analysis with the UAVs. This first glance at the analysis looks at standoff systems, meaning systems that couldn't survive the North Korean air defenses, and therefore would have to stand off, we assumed 80 kilometers offshore. And so this could be viewed as Global Hawk or JSTARS or even an EP3. And basically the answer is they have terrific capability and they have limited capability, both. Which is, if any North Korean systems are anywhere near the coast, it's going to be very, very hard for them to stay unseen. But what it does essentially is it channels their mobile missiles into a small area in the center of their country, which presumably makes them easier to locate using other systems. If you layer on top of this some penetrating UAVs, and the United States has, again, the Iranians declassified this for the United States by shooting down one RQ-170. But if you layer on this a small number, we've done it with 3, we've done it with 4 penetrating UAV orbits. The answer basically is a smallish country like North Korea, you can get essentially 100% coverage continuously of their roads using a handful of UAVs, if the penetrating UAVs are survivable, and that's a question. All right, what does this all mean? Let's take a step up. Every country's situation is different. Peacetime is different than wartime, both because an adversary would get to generate their systems. Also, though, because in war times, think about the North Korean case, the United States would have done a variety of things to suppress North Korean air defenses. So in a wartime situation, some things would have changed to make things easier for the United States, some things harder. Every country is different because the topography is different, because the size of the country is different. And so these answers can't be applied just simply to other countries. Rather, the analysis would have to be redone, and all these countries would provide different answers. And we could talk in Q&A about some of that if you'd like. But the point is, from the standpoint of 20,000 feet, since 1950, essentially, as Keir said at the beginning of the talk, countries have protected their nuclear forces through some combination of hardening, concealment, and redundancy. The redundancy leg is really disappearing from every country's arsenal as we dramatically reduce the number of these systems. Technology has essentially negated hardening as a strategy. Hardening doesn't make sense. It has not negated concealment, but it is chipping away at concealment. And the challenge for those who want to hide nuclear systems is dramatically higher today than it was 10 years ago, and it will be dramatically higher 25 years from now than it is today. All right, what does this all mean? We've thought much more, to be frank, about the implications for U.S. force structure than we have for the UK's force structure or other countries. For the United States, it raises, as Keir said, both risks and opportunities. For the United States, in terms of risks, it raises real questions about the U.S.'s survivability strategy. Like, in our opinion, it makes it rather difficult for the United States to justify building another new generation fixed ICBM. It also raises questions about the SSBN, not as a system that contributes to survivability, but really as the survivable system, in the sense that there's an argument to be made that in the Cold War they were actually not nearly as survivable as people assumed, but today they're getting more and more threatened than they were in the past. So it raises questions about what the U.S.'s survivability plan is. In terms of offensive capabilities, as this suggests, this opens lots of doors in terms of opportunities for the United States to hold at risk arsenals around the world, particularly small arsenals, whether we're talking about North Korea or China or maybe some others as well. And it raises the policy question, how far does the United States want to go down that path? There are big benefits of going down that path, especially in wartime situations. There are costs and risks associated with generating a response by adversaries, which we wish we didn't. And that's a new challenge which we're going to have to confront. We'd be happy to talk a little bit about UK force structure and kind of some questions, but I'll tell you that's not an area of kind of focus that we have. In terms of strategic stability, frankly, over the past 20 years, people have assumed that nuclear weapons basically equaled survivable nuclear weapons. And our sense, and based on some preliminary analysis we've done, is to say, yes, some dyads are characterized by mutual survivability of arsenals, and some dyads are not. And there has not been very much open source work asking the question.
Sorry, what are dyads?
Oh, I'm sorry. Relationships between two countries, in the sense that we don't think of a nuclear arsenal as being inherently survivable or inherently vulnerable. It depends on who's targeting it. So if you said, what is North Korea's, or is China's nuclear arsenal survivable? My guess is vis-a-vis Russia, yes. Vis-a-vis the United States, no. And so that's what I meant by dyads. I'm sorry. So what we'd say is, this analysis needs to be done at the unclassified level and the classified level too. Really re-asking the question, India, Pakistan, are they survivable or not? Israel has some questions to answer for its own force, etc. And lastly, about arms control, it raises the serious question, pokes aside at the arms control community, it raises the serious question of, given that we simply do live in an age in which pinpoint accuracy is here now and is only getting better, given that we do live in an age in which sensor technology is mind-boggling, and it's only going to get better, are we all actually making the world safer by reducing the number of targets in the remaining nuclear stocks in the world? And doing so actually reduces some dangers, having a smaller number of nuclear weapons, and it increases other dangers. And that analysis we don't think has been adequately done given the realities of the sensor revolution, the accuracy revolution. Let's leave it there and just kick off a conversation about any aspects of this you'd like to discuss. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you both. That was extremely thought-provoking, and it obviously rests on a considerable amount of empirical research. I have a lot of questions myself, but I will hold them for the moment and open it up to the floor. We have just about half an hour for questions. Please introduce yourself before you ask. We'll take probably a few rounds. Yes, sir.
My name is Bruce George. I was a member of Parliament for 36 years, Labour, not Labour now. How on earth is the posh little country like North Korea able to get a sophisticated weapon system? Did they steal it? Did experts switch sides? That does make me feel nervous, and I wonder how they managed to get that devastating capability. Thank you.
Next person on my list is Dana Allen.
Hi, I'm editor of Survival. It seemed, I came in late, so maybe you mentioned this, but you couldn't have discussed it very long. The whole dimension of missile defense, which strikes me, which it seems to me that I chaired you guys on the subject of, on a similar theme quite a few years ago. Because it seems to me that it's tool of survivability, but obviously also a tool of first strike invulnerability. So that's not the right word, but you know what I mean.
Yes.
Paul Schultz.
I was going to mention, of course, myself, eventually, one might call it the revenge of technology in the preservation of nuclear balance. But SSBNs, I think we have to talk about since you're in the UK.
Mm-hmm.
So, spoofing, jamming, decoys underwater, but decoys above water sound quite a cheap and effective way for North Korea and other people. And I'm not sure how they factor into this. Also, some of these super accurate machines may be impacting on rubber dummies. And almost finally, numbers still count, don't they? I mean, in any Eurasian scenario, there are some thousands of Russian theater weapons. How many, we don't know, but that's an indication of how far accuracy in sensing has to go. So that class of very largely replicated mobile weapons doesn't seem to disappear in its importance because of the erosion of redundancy. And finally, I guess, in terms of the politics of any nuclear confrontation, how much are your computations, although enthusiastically embraced by, or reluctantly embraced by generals, going to feed through to the general political disposition to risk a full-on confrontation, let alone some kind of nuclear release? It's not obvious to me that this is going to be persuasive in the North Atlantic Council or even the White House.
Great, let's take those three.
Yeah, great. Why don't I start so that Daryl can get his thoughts together. We play good cop, bad cop. I come across as the unorganized respondent. I would say, first of all, just Paul, on your points, and I'll start with the last. Look, any U.S. president, first of all, imagine a conventional conflict tomorrow on the Korean Peninsula, where provocations occur, things escalate, Combined Forces Command, U.S. and South Koreans are fighting against North Korea. It's going to be a conventional rout, okay? And as that's happening, North Korea has huge incentives to escalate to nuclear use, not to hit Los Angeles if they could, but to use a nuclear weapon, to threaten nuclear use, to coerce a halt to the conflict before it's too late, because they're going down and they know it, okay? So this could happen tomorrow. A president that's faced with a choice, presented with two options. Option A, to do counterforce, to eliminate North Korea's nuclear systems after it's begun to use them or has threatened to use them. That results in millions of people dying. Or option B, which results in counterforce in which thousands are dying in a conflict that's probably already resulted in thousands dying. It's a big difference. And so the job of military commanders is to present options to civilian authorities that achieve national objectives. And one of the national objectives would be to protect the United States, South Korean forces, and citizens in a way that is, has the least largest effect on civilians. And so, just the one slice of this about reduced fratricide, reduced fatalities, can have a dramatic implication, and the ability to do it. Resulting, we can, Dr. Strangelove, we can do it, but we're going to get our hair mussed. There's a big difference between saying we're going to get our hair mussed and, we're not, 99% probability, just based on expectations that this will result in something. So it's a dramatic leap. It's not a marginal improvement between what we could do in 1985 versus today, and that's happening all around the world. Just quickly on submarines. It's not a quick response, but I do have one thing to say, and I'm sure Daryl will have more to say. I think to make 2 points, and we address in the article version of this, which will be published in International Security, the journal, in the spring. We have a section on submarines that would be more relevant as well. But there is 2 basic points. Number one is when we look back at the past, there was this assumption that submarines were essentially invulnerable. Once you send them to sea, you can't find them. The game's over. We live in a mad world. Well, we now know there were periods in the Cold War in which the United States and its allies could track every single Soviet sub from departure at a port on deployment and back. And they could tell the whole number of basically the sub that was at sea at any given time. So there was a period in which the Soviets thought they had an invulnerable force, when in fact it was completely vulnerable. Okay? And that was a variable in the Cold War. We can't assume that it's automatic. Turning to today, of course, it's a case where the United States has the most awesome ASW capabilities, and so for a British decision maker to think about the British deterrent, if you're confident that U.S.-British relations are going to be good for the foreseeable future, you'll probably be less concerned about the vulnerability of submarines. But again, as an objective issue about the trends in technology and the ability now to peer through the oceans as if they're transparent, it's not just limited to the U.S., and trends are moving in the direction where the oceans as a sanctuary could be a delusional assumption.
Did you bring in your calculations things like decoys and active deception measures, which would be part of this?
We've started to do that analysis with respect to the mobile missile. So let me say a couple things really quickly. So Dana's point on missile defense, couldn't agree more. Missile defense is another technology which layers on top of sensing and accuracy. So if you make a list of the various technologies which kind of add to first strike capabilities, it's everything from ASW cued by these kinds of sensors, conventional precision strike, cyber, which we didn't talk about, which is a huge component of strategic counterforce capabilities. It's missile defense to clean up any things that you missed. So absolutely. Decoys and such. So Keir and I presented this at a different version of this at a handful of different places, and those were not for attribution, so I won't reveal where. But somebody who is very, very familiar with the details of U.S. thinking about counterforce today at the classified level said to us at the unclassified level, this is all correct, but the big giant omission is you're not focused on the big innovations in ATR and artificial intelligence. So automatic target recognition, artificial intelligence. And he said, for explanatory reasons, to talk to an unclassified audience, what you have to talk about is radar visibility. And he's like, that's all right, and it's changing the world the way you're saying. But he said, the real changes are in artificial intelligence and ATR for the exact purpose that you're saying. And you can go, and as we've mined the unclassified engineering literature on remote sensing to learn the kinds of things that we have, there's an entire parallel literature in that field that one can mine to look at a variety of unclassified studies for distinguishing decoys of various types. And I think that's what you said is right on the mark. That's where the game currently is. The game is not, can you see their roads? You can. The game is with what frequency can you distinguish car size from truck size, and truck size with these certain characteristics from those. And my understanding is the short version is in North Korea it's pretty easy because there aren't that many vehicles. In China, where there's lots and lots of vehicles, it's more difficult. But that's exactly where the fight is. Last thing, I'll just emphasize what Keir said. In my opinion, I think it's our opinion, Keir's in my opinion, is that this big leap means nothing in peacetime. For the exact reasons, in peacetime, nobody wants a nuclear war. God, it's the worst thing you could possibly imagine. You have a good chance or you have no chance. It means the same thing in peacetime. In wartime, whether it's, as Keir said, North Korea using 1 or 2 to stop the United States, these numbers start meaning something different. Or in the India-Pakistan border, with Pakistan using 2 tactical weapons to thwart India, an Indian analysis that says we think we can get them all, suddenly means something different in wartime once Pakistan's crossed the threshold than it does in peacetime. And so at least in our opinion, that's where this becomes dangerously relevant.
Does anyone want to tackle Bruce George's question very briefly on, how can it possibly be that North Korea can pose?
I think the answer in a nutshell is, and we've kind of tweaked the arms control community by saying they've got us down to dangerous numbers. But your question raises what the arms control community should be lauded for, which is your question identifies exactly how simple basic nuclear technology is, such that Pakistan could get it when they did, and North Korea did. And it basically says what a great success the non-proliferation community has had by convincing through a variety of different means other countries from getting it. So I think it's a great observation that even North Korea can use this technology.
Desmond Byrne.
Desmond Byrne, I'm a member here and a former defence official. Sensors, I think, it's really fascinating. And I don't think I've got a sort of further point, but the fact is that the nature of defence organisations and the defence research organisations is that somebody has a grand invention so that you can penetrate the oceans or have new sorts of ways of determining capability, and the result is that the opposition produce some countermeasures of increasingly elaborate. So there's a kind of action-reaction which goes on ad infinitum, and I don't know whether there's a sort of point at which actually the ability to perceive and penetrate, will always outrank and the capability will be greater than those sort of defensive measures. But I mean, it seems to me that that's and there will be periods where there is vulnerability. I mean, just as for the UK, there was vulnerability with Polaris to the point where we needed to have a secret program of Cheveline.
Yes.
And while Cheveline was being sort of made good secretly, actually our capability was not effective.
Yes.
But and even members of the House of Commons Defence Committee probably were not informed of that until later on, Bruce.
Much later on.
Much later. But the other thing I just wanted to say was about, I mean, it's interesting because I mean you're clearly American and I'm British. I mean, you think about counterforce. I don't think we've been thinking about counterforce in the UK for a long time. I mean, my recollection at the time of the Cold War, the sort of formulation was that we needed to have the ability to strike key aspects of Soviet state power. So we moved well away from the idea that we were going to think about their missile sites or anything else. We were actually trying to eliminate, decapitate the organisation of the then Soviet state, and we haven't actually moved very far away from that. Although we do have clearly, an ability to produce a lower yield for sort of signalling purposes, but that's quite a limited capability as against the sort of notion of decapitation. So, I mean, it's quite. I mean, I'm not sure what my question is, but there's a real difference between the position that we're in, which is, vital interest, absolutely last resort, preventing ourselves from being annihilated, rather than thinking about North Korea and preventing them from having a capability.
Yes, sir.
The analogy you gave with the United States and Korea, where there's such a great preponderance in the case of the United States, and you said there'll be far fewer casualties if they were to use counter-force strategy as opposed to counter-city strategy. But if one were to look at less imbalanced countries like India and Pakistan, what would a counter-force strategy would be highly unstable for nuclear deterrence. Now, in the 70s, when I actually studied international relations strategic studies, the counter-force strategy was supposed to be highly unstable even between Soviet Union and the United States, and that's why you had the ABM Treaty of 1972. So the counter-city strategy is just to provide a measure of deterrence stability. And of course, this has great political implications in terms of war and peace.
Mm-hmm.
Your account, of course, does not relate to that. I'm just wondering, have you thought about that, and have the United States and Russia abandoned the idea of strategic stability, and they're both pursuing counter-force strategy with a vengeance? And if so, then other countries are likely to follow to varying degrees, depending upon their technological capability.
Okay, and last question in this round. So.
Yeah, I've been following, sorry, my name is Norman Moss, I remember the ISS. I've been following nuclear wars for several decades and different kinds of nuclear wars. They're all paper wars. We have no practical experience to draw on, thankfully. If an attack on North Korea, it's got to be 100%. If you miss one missile, they could then, and probably would, destroy Tokyo. A couple of years from now, they destroy Seattle, San Francisco. Is any American president ever going to take a chance? Are you ever going to persuade an American president that there is no chance of this happening? You certainly couldn't persuade me on the basis of theoretical calculations.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Okay, so answer to these, and we can squeeze in one more round.
Do you want to go
I'll
first again? Do you want me to go first?
I'll go
again?
first again. I'll pick two and then
All right.
let you go first.
Okay.
I mean, again, just on the last issue, North Korean example. Again, what would an American president do? I'm especially not going to answer that question today, because the answer is nobody knows what Donald Trump would do. But the fact of the matter is, I think it's a mistake to assume. Again, we understood the notion of it has to be 100% when it was the U.S. and the Soviet Union contemplating all-out, nuclear war, a splendid first strike capability. That made sense in a context of a North Korean conflict, where North Korea has hit Kadena Air Force Base with a 20 kiloton nuclear weapon, or detonated one over the Sea of Japan, and threatened to hit Tokyo tomorrow. A president is going to be receiving a lot of pressure from his or her allies, and is going to be contemplating in his own mind the balance between needing to do something now to prevent that from happening, or to strike and with confidence eliminate those capabilities. In the end, you're balancing off more than a bunch of different grim options. One which could be to concede and halt the conflict. I mean, that is one option. You could do that. It's probably going to break your entire line system, and you're pulling out of East Asia permanently at that point. And South Korea and Japan will get nuclear weapons and all the rest. So there are a bunch of different. They're all bad strategies, bad options. But it does not seem inconceivable to me that a president would decide to move forward with counterforce in that kind of scenario. The other one that I'll respond to is on the action-reaction process. Of course, it's a great, this is all human history, all military history has been, act and then a reaction. One of the main purposes of this analysis, indeed a book that we're working on, is to challenge the idea that has somehow ruled in the nuclear analysis realm that we live in kind of a world of one-way streets. That, once you reach you have a second strike capability, you have strategic stability. Game over. We can almost ignore nuclear weapons at that point. Nobody's going to contemplate using one. The uncertainty, the inability to disarm the other, and that's just taken as an assumption. It really is, and it's colored so much of the analysis. So simply to restore the idea that there is that strategic stability might be a variable. Is an important one. So it could be that in 20 years, the hider all of a sudden has new technologies for, invisibility cloaks for their silos. Who knows? But the point is, for the time being and for several decades to come, all the trends are pointing in the opposite direction of greater transparency through remote sensing and the ability to actually identify and target those capabilities. And again, we start to sound, when we say, there's so many other things going on, you can't take our word for it, but you want to know whether a decoy is real or not? Well, we have a spectroscopy and interferometry, and what radioactive signals is this giving off? It's amazing, the developments that are happening. And again, they all do seem to be helping the seeker and not the hider for the time being.
A couple things really quickly on the question of from the ears of somebody from Britain, how might one hear this given the fact that it sounds unlikely you're going to get into the counterforce competition game yourself? To my ears, the places where this would matter most, if I were a British defense planner, I think it matters a lot for my thoughts about vulnerability of my own forces. It's the counterforce revolution as it affects my own plans and expenditures for survivability is number one. And the question being, let me leave it at that, number one. Number two, I think that that both the UK and the United States, I think, have largely been had very similar policies with respect to arms reductions in the last 15 years, and have basically had very similar policies, believing that, given that we live in a nuclear world, the fewer the better. Not just the fewer countries who have them, but the fewer numbers. And I think in my opinion, both your government and mine has to really rethink that from the standpoint of stability and ask, if you're in the United States and you're a neocon, you might say, I don't care about stability, I just want counterforce capabilities. If you're the United States and you believe in strategic stability, or you're in the United Kingdom and you believe in strategic stability, I think people need to they need to redo the analysis and ask, are technology trends going on now actually leading to worlds of mutual survivability across the dyads? Or are they not? And do we need to rethink our joint arms reductions and control political programs. So I think, in my view, that's where the rubber meets the road for the UK, both in terms of its force structure and its assumptions about its own force survivability, and in terms of the assumption that smaller numbers around the world lead to more peace. We have to re-ask that. The question about India-Pakistan, we couldn't agree more. We think that actually one of the dyads around the world where this is going to have the most dangerous consequences, for exactly the reason Keir said, which is the important consequences are not in peacetime, whereas you quite wisely said, to any president or prime minister, a 1% chance of failure is going to look like a disaster. But in wartime, if Pakistan uses nuclear weapons in a conventional war, or North Korea does, or China does in a conventional war, suddenly 1% chance of failure is 99% chance of protecting your allies or protecting your cities. And so we agree entirely that this raises really troubling questions about the South Asian nuclear balance.
Excellent. Okay, last round. Yes, sir.
Thanks.
Can I get your name, sir?
Yeah, James Manning.
James.
So throughout the Cold War, obviously the premise between East and West was around mutual destruction. And I think it's probably fair to say that for the US and NATO states, including the UK, it's probably still the same principle that you use nuclear deterrence because of principles of MAT. But what we're seeing now from North Korea, and particularly Russia, is the doctrine of escalate to de-escalate, and the idea of tactical nukes, which we know countries such as Pakistan as well have and would be potentially willing to use. So do we need to update our doctrine of nuclear, not just as a kind of a second strike last resort, but actually blending it with conventional capabilities as part of a kind of a de-escalatory in the event of a conventional war?
Chris?
Response.
Yeah, it's kind of been answered. My question was about the pace of the defensive technology against the offensive emerging technologies that we see from a sort of submarine, and your conclusion seemed to be that you think that the offensive is moving at a faster rate. Despite that, the P5 all seem to be still investing in renewing their submarine capabilities or looking to do that in the future. Do you think they're all in denial on that question? But you kind of answered it, but it'd be interesting to hear your view.
Chris, you want to introduce yourself as well?
Oh, sorry, yeah, Chris Clapham, UK MOD.
Tim Wilsey, Chatham House. In your presentation, it seemed you were almost exclusively talking about counterforce being nuclear, i.e. you were firing nuclear missiles at nuclear installations. Going back to what you were talking about earlier about North Korea, I find it inconceivable that the United States or anyone else, just because they happen to identify, North Korea's 4 warheads, that would suddenly decide to launch a nuclear strike out of a clear blue sky. But actually, if there was a conventional way of doing it, or maybe a special forces way, that might then become credible. And the other example where I think it might be credible is this thing that I know has exercised people in the Pentagon over many years, is, what if an Islamist group, I don't know, the Taliban, Pakistan Taliban or IS, took over Pakistan and inherited its nuclear arsenal? Again, out of a clear blue sky, you could not launch nuclear missiles at Pakistan. You need to look at another form of counterforce.
Let me add 2 things to your list. One is, I don't think you talked about space. How is a preemptive anti-satellite strike or something like that, how does that work as a strategy to counter this kind of counterforce? And the second thing is about I'm going to quibble with your terminology on the arms control community, because I think what you mean when you say arms control community is people who don't like nuclear weapons and want to reduce them. Mm-hmm. But there's another approach out there, and there are bits of your presentation which speak to this, which is about shaping nuclear arsenals for stability, which is also arms control. Mm-hmm. In fact, that's what arms control is, rather than arms reduction. One of the things you mentioned was, is it a good idea for the US to have a next generation of fixed silo ICBMs? So do I read you right that one question to ask might start to be, is there a restraint regime available that tries to avoid counterforce questions getting too sharp, or is that just not going to work? Or alternatively, is it going to work only when some of these capabilities are real and in the field, and then you can get rid of them rather than sort of preemptive restraint? Okay. And if you have a question, do get it in now, because this is the last round. Okay, over to you.
Just the wider implications of disarmament arms control negotiation. India-Pakistan thing is only a specific example of potential instability in the nuclear strategic relationships, and how much attention is being paid to kind of restore some kind of stability, recognizing that strategic stability is a variable and not a constant.
I don't know what I was thinking reopening the floor. Paul.
I want to ask a little more about missile defense, because you used it in the sword and shield version. But
Yes.
missile defense surely would complicate the many-on-one algorithms and the ability to take things out with elegant precision. I haven't heard how you calculated for that. And more widely, accuracy. I'd like to hear more about underwater decoys, UUVs. Really talked about those, but also the way in which accuracy and precision and speed, all the things you've talked about, might again keep this counterforce task very difficult by knocking down some of the sensors you've mentioned, penetrating drones, for example. But there may be other kinds too, blinding space satellites, or knocking down, or spoofing, or jamming other things. And if you add those into the equation, which are technologies which could be invested in, and for people who like SSBNs, that might be one of the things you have to invest, or that menu would have to be invested in. And when you add those possibilities into your calculations, I wonder how robust your conclusions remain.
Okay, you have at least 7 questions. We're already over time, so I suggest 3 minutes each, if that works. But that might involve some division of labour. So, who wants to go first?
Well, I'll go first again. And I'll have just one response, other than to say, on accuracy, underwater decoys, the counterforce revolution in the realm of, there was the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist recently, had a couple pieces about the trends in ASW and how clearly the sort of seekers are gaining an advantage over the hiders, under the surface of the oceans. But again, a huge topic, very important. I don't want to minimize it, but I guess the overarching response I'd have to a couple of these comments, and particularly even the point about a restraint regime for counterforce or shaping of arms control reductions and response to others. The counterforce capabilities that we're talking about here today, right, are it is almost impossible to imagine how you roll them back, right? How are you going to roll back weapons accuracy? Number one, how are you going to have any kind of verification regime of accuracy? Here, come take a look at what makes our system so accurate. It's almost impossible to imagine how you could have an arbitrary regime. But more importantly, forget about nuclear. In the conventional realm, all the trends are toward developing these technologies in remote sensing and accuracy. Even if nuclear weapons didn't exist, we would be pursuing these things, particularly if you're the United States. And particularly if you don't abandon the current grand strategy, which is to dominate all of the global commons. People find it strange when we talk about U.S. pursuing nuclear counterforce, as if this is bizarre. We're pursuing, primacy in every dimension of military force. Why are nukes so different? Again, maybe people misunderstand what the United States is doing. We want to control the seas, we want to control the air, we want to control the space, and we're pursuing capabilities to do that. We're talking about the implications of advances that have occurred in large part being pursued for those purposes, and their implications for nuclear targeting. I think that the United States and others are deeply interested in conventional capabilities. And those are coming online quite quickly, and for the reasons you talk about. But I think it's a mistake to assume that a nuclear response to particularly nuclear escalation, as James suggested, what is the response? These things are becoming much more important, particularly if fratricide is not an issue, particularly if radioactive fallout can be reduced. Nuclear weapons may be more usable, both because of the strategic context and because of their consequences from using them now compared to 1985.
Many great comments, thank you, and these are going to help our kind of final version. I'll just say a couple things. I think the main pushback which we think is exactly correct. It's neither a disagreement with what we're saying, nor is it wrong. It's right, which is which is the sensing systems we identified and those we didn't are vulnerable to countermeasures. Whether you're talking about ground-based systems to decoy or to dazzle satellites, whether you're talking about kinetic anti-satellite weapons, whether you're talking about side lobe jamming of radar systems, these all exist. Both our systems, our sensing systems have been deployed, and everyone from the Russians to the Chinese to the North Koreans are developing, past tense, have developed counters. But this is what, in a way, Keir and I are pointing out. We're not arguing, and please don't take from this, that nuclear systems around the world are all vulnerable and will remain so. What we're saying is that we've gone from a world in which a moderate number of fairly sophisticated nuclear systems were survivable to one in which almost every dyad around the world, the survivability is a question mark. And in a way, the alarming thing is not simply that Keir and I cannot answer how survivable Russian subs are today. It's that the Russians do not know. They have their assessment, but they don't know either. And so what we're basically saying is we're back into this era, which I guess we always were in, but into a more intense era of back and forth, measure, countermeasure, measure, countermeasure. And that's not how nuclear deterrence is supposed to play out. Nuclear deterrence is supposed to have this finality that Keir described, where they're terrifying weapons, but the upside is they're going to create stalemate. To now the new era is they're terrifying weapons, and we don't know across dyads whose are survivable and whose are not. And that in the case of a conventional war where people are threatening to use them, that's a dangerous world. So yes, countermeasures exist already, are real, people are trying them, and there's the countermeasures, and it's back and forth. With respect to about Keir, partly, I think maybe largely answer this arms control question. You're exactly right. I messed up the terminology. There's arms cuts, there's arms control. And what Keir said is, I think, exactly right, which is you can't define a regime that's going to prevent the sensor revolution. Partly because it's so absolutely a core part of 21st century life, economic life, civilian life. It's not going away unless sunspots wipe out all of our electronics. It is, and so limiting this is about as fruitless as limiting accuracy improvements. And so that is the world we live in. Lastly, and there were many questions, I'd love to talk to you about nuclear doctrine. And no, we don't think the US or the British should incorporate nuclear weapons as conventional warfighting doctrine. We could talk more about that afterwards. But let me quickly talk the question about everybody's investing in subs. Have they all drank the Kool-Aid? Have they all gone the right way? And I started jotting, when you started writing, I was like, no, of course not. Good point. I agree with you. No, of course they have not. And had reasons why what they're doing with submarines makes sense. And for the most technologically sophisticated countries in the world, submarines are probably about as survivable a weapon as you can get. And for a country with a long naval history who's rather good at operating naval systems, whether you're talking about the British, United Kingdom, and the United States, same. But then I started jotting, in response to the arms control, other things about submarines, and I just want to kind of put them on the table and you should think about with respect to arms control. Number one is, from an arms control shaping weapon systems, submarines are a disaster. Why? Because it puts, in the UK case, 100%, but in the US case, it puts a huge number of warheads in a single tube of metal. So the whole arms control approach to ICBMs is ideally one warhead per reentry vehicle. This is 100, 200 warheads per small tube of metal. It's also a tube of metal which is uniquely vulnerable to conventional attack if you can locate it. So it doesn't require any attacks. Those are nightmares from an arms control outcome. Number three, it's a failed deadly system. A country's SSBN force is entirely invulnerable until the day that it's entirely vulnerable. Whereas if Russia is going to move their accuracy down from 150 meters CEP to up to 70 meters or 60 meters, we're going to see it. Because they're going to have to test those missiles over and over and over and over and over again. But when a country goes from not being able to find Russian subs to trailing every single one of them on deployment, there's going to be a lag in which before Russia figures that out, and then they will, and then they'll respond as they did in the Cold War. But it's a failed deadly system, the SSBN. And then, I guess, very lastly, is it's a system which has the other edge of the sword here, which is not only is it a rather survivable system till the day that it's not, it's also the best counterforce weapon that exists. Because not only is it highly, highly, highly accurate, but it's able to deliver weapons from very, very, very close. And back in the 1980s, if you guys were doing nuclear stuff in the 1980s, we all knew that depressed trajectories were dangerous, but they all had the other side, which is that they reduced accuracy. Depressed trajectories don't reduce accuracy anymore. And so if you can have 6-minute response, 6 minutes from launch to arrival, the submarine is both, it's the most survival system of all. I understand why the UK and the US are leaning on it. It's also the most potent counterforce weapon of all. And it's also a failed deadly system, particularly for countries who are not the UK or the US. So I'll leave you with that.
Well, on that happy note.
Yes.
Thank you, Daryl, and thank you, Keir, for your excellent presentations, and thank you all for, I think, what was a very rich discussion afterwards. And please do join me in thanking yourselves and our two speakers in the usual way. Thank you.